Okay, so can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. So welcome everybody, and I'm glad that you guys have taken the time to join us today for a review of GCP E6R2. This is a back to basics course. So if you've been working in clinical trials for a while and seeking a bit of a refresher on what these guidelines and standards are and how they apply to your practice, then this course is for you. If you are new to clinical trials or to clinical research, we welcome you as well. So this is the first session of 2, and I'm co-presenting with Stella Park today. Stella is the HRPP Quality Assurance Manager, and I'm Jacqueline Legier, the HRPP Director. So we're just going to flip back and forth, and hopefully, I won't run into any technical issues because I could encounter one connectivity problems. I do experience that sometimes with Teams, so I'm just going to apologize up front, and then to stopping to share my slides so that Stella can take over. So I'm just going to, preempt any kind of issues with that sort of a disclaimer. So this is our research services team. There are 16 members of the team, and I know there's a couple of members on the call who have sort of recognize your pictures up there. But we're a large team. We're a regional team. We're spread across all the major facilities: Fredericton, St. John, and Moncton. So we have representatives in each area, but we are regional in scope. So if there's any questions about your research operations or your research education and training needs, just feel free to reach out to us anytime. We've got people that work in multiple areas of research, from contracts and budgets reviews to helping you do HRPP REB submissions to project management consultations. If you want to do a research study and you're doing it from scratch and you need some help with your protocol design, and right down to data analysis and engagement. So Bryn Robinson is our patient engagement manager, who's been doing a lot lately with trying to ensure that participant voice is really reflected throughout the research spectrum. So those are our contact information down there, our emails. So please feel free to reach out to us anytime. So what we're going to focus on today is we're going back to basics with ICH GCP for a couple of reasons. It had a recent revision a couple of years ago, and it's also going through a third revision. So we're going to focus on 3 specific areas today. We're looking at sort of the principles of GCP. We're going to look at the informed consent process through the GCP lens, and then also the investigator responsibilities. So specifically, the learning objectives is to understand the purpose, organization, and structure of ICH and the guidelines. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the investigative responsibilities because there was a significant shift in investigator oversight responsibilities with the second revision of GCP. So that's going to have a major impact on your operations. But they're also these principles are adaptable if you're not doing clinical trials with drugs or devices. So they're really good principles to apply right across the board if you're working in clinical research. We're going to look at the requirements for complying with informed consent regulations, and we're also going to look at the process for getting informed consent. So a little bit about ICH. So ICH is the International Council on Harmonization, and the mission is for harmonization of better health. So the ICH is actually, it's an organization that was started way back in 1990. And it was restructured in 2016. So it's now a legal international entity under Swiss law, which creates guidelines for the harmonization of clinical trial operations to ensure that clinical trials are conducted safely, effectively, and to the highest quality. So it's really with respect to governing medicinal products in clinical trials. So the intent is to ensure that when clinical trials are administered to research participants, they are done so to the highest quality to make sure participants are safe and that the information or the data that is generated is of the highest quality. So really, it's meant to do it in a resource efficient manner. And there's meant to be harmonization across all different countries who are working on clinical trials so that the data that's generated in different countries can be adapted and approved by different regulatory authorities. I included the ICH link down there if you want to go and have a look. It's quite it's a dense website. There's a lot of information on it, but it has educational opportunities there, interpretations of the different guidelines that are available to you. And of course, all the guidelines are on their website as well. So ICH just recently had their 30-year anniversary, and they restructured a few years ago. And the new co-chair is actually a Canadian, so it's a physician that works with Health Canada, which is really good to to have that Canadian perspective on the council. So the council itself is made up of a number of representatives. So there's the regulator group, of which Health Canada is part of that. There's the European Commission or the European Union. There's the Ministry of Health and Welfare representing Japan. Switzerland is represented, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration as well. There are industry members, so there's pharmaceutical members, and then there are observers. So the observers to the process would be representatives from Brazil, China, South Korea, and the World Health Organization as well. But the council really is a joint initiative involving both industry and regulators. And they do have over 25 working groups, and the working groups are responsible for the development of each one of the individual guidelines. So what is the formal ICH process when they want to develop a guideline? Well, first of all, there is a member of the working groups or a member of the council would bring forth an idea for development of a guideline. And then there has to be adoption of that topic, and then there's the establishment of a working committee. So the working committee or the working group helps to develop the technical document, and that's done through consensus building. And I can compare to my experience in developing the research standards, the Canadian research standards. So this is very much the process that is established by a standard development organization. It's very tightly controlled on how standards documents are developed, and there is a stepwise process. And it is through consensus that the technical document is developed. So in the step 2 of the process is the decision making on the draft by the ICH Assembly. So the industry representatives and the regulatory members, adopt the consensus document and then release it for public consultation. So then there would be a certain number of days that it's out for public consultation. It's usually either 60 or 90 days. Those comments are taken back into consideration, and the document would be revised based on the type of feedback that they've received. And then it would move on to step 3, which is a regulatory consultation and discussion. So that is when the document goes out to the larger regulatory groups in the different ICH countries. So once that process has been completed, there would be adoption of the final ICH guidelines, and it's adopted by the regulatory members and of the ICH Assembly. And then, of course, step 5 moves into implementation. So if we look at ICH E6R2, it was formally adopted by or implemented. The expectation by Health Canada is that would be fully implemented by April 2019. So now when they come to inspect against E6, the expectation is that the site would have implemented all of the guidelines required or as outlined in ICH E6R2. So there are a number of guidelines. There's actually 200 guidelines in total. So the ICH has different working groups for each one of these sections. So there's a working group for quality guidelines development. There's working groups for safety guidelines. Multidisciplinary is a group or a topic that typically fall outside of the quality, safety, or efficacy guidelines. And you can refer to their website to see specifically which, what areas each one of these working groups addresses. What we're focusing on today is the efficacy guidelines, and E6R2 falls under the efficacy guidelines. Let's move ahead. So what are the E family member of guidelines? So there are a number of guidelines under the E family. So I think there are up to there's up to 19 now. So they deal with specific areas of clinical trials and clinical trial operations. So there's design and analysis, looking at dose response studies. E9 is a really good section to look at if you're involved with the design of clinical trials, because it walks you through the different statistical principles with respect to clinical trials. E10 is the choice of control group, and E17 is a relatively new one, and it's because there's been so much work with multi-regional clinical trials, so they felt there was a need to create a guideline specifically speaking to that area. There's the safety reporting. Those of you who work in clinical trials and have to submit serious adverse events are operating under E2A. So that E2A addresses serious adverse event collection and appropriate reporting. Populations is, what appropriate populations to include in your clinical trials. There's would be populations that would be in situations of vulnerability, such as geriatric populations and the pediatric population. Genetics and genomics, that's specifically to those areas. E8 has been around since 1997, but E8 is a really important guideline to pay attention to. It talks about the general considerations of clinical trials, and it's recently been updated. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more a couple of slides down, but for right now, I just want to focus on the last one, which is E6, good clinical practice. So these speak to, again, I said the efficacy family of guidelines, and our focus today is on E6. So what are the two most important goals of ICH E6 standard? So essentially, E6 focuses on these two areas, which are to assure that rights, well-being, and confidentiality of all trial subjects are protected, and to assure that the trial data are credible. So these are the two main things. If there's anything to take away from today, if anybody asks you what the heck is E6 about, well, it's those two things. It's participant protection and credible data. So everything that is within E6, everything that you're going to do is going to focus around those two specific areas. So the ICH GCP guideline integrated addendum, or R2, provides a unified standard for the EU, Japan, the US, Canada, Switzerland to facilitate mutual acceptance of data from clinical trials by the regulatory authorities in these jurisdictions. So I touched on that a little bit earlier to say that the reason there was a need identified back early in the 1990s to even have E6 in the first place is because different regulatory authorities in different countries couldn't necessarily trust that the data that was created in other countries was done so in the most appropriate or ethical or credible manner. So they said, if we get everybody essentially to follow the same standard, then at least we can guarantee that participants in those studies were protected if they follow the guideline, and that the data that they're submitting to us to approve was credible. So it was also to prevent duplication of efforts as well, and for appropriate use of resources for clinical trials. So Health Canada implementation of R2 became effective April 3rd, 2019, and we've been doing training since then, and the city program trainings have been updated as well to reflect the new revision. And it's called R2 because R1 was the very first iteration that was released in 1997. So that's why it's called R2. You guys can interject at any time and ask questions. I'm happy to answer anything as we go along. So there's different sections of ICH E6 guideline. It starts out with the glossary, and you guys will see in the glossary that there's also definition of terms. There's 13 principles of ICH that are articulated in section 2. IRB is a section unto itself, investigator section, sponsor, the clinical trial protocol and amendments, 6 and 7, investigators' brochures in there as well, and essential documents are listed in section 8. So we're just going to quickly go through the 13 principles of GCP, but you'll see from these principles that every requirement you're obligated to be compliant with in GCP is directly related back to one of these 13 principles. So the first one is that clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with the ethical principles of the Declaration of Helsinki. So the Declaration of Helsinki, of course, was the World Health Organization guidance document that was released in 1964, and it's really intended or directed at physicians who are conducting research with human research participants. The Declaration of Helsinki followed the Nuremberg Code, because even though the Nuremberg Code was meant to be an international document on ethical conduct of research, it really wasn't adopted internationally. So there were still research violations that were being carried out. So the World Medical Association decided to release its own document that has guiding principles for physicians that are conducting clinical research. Before initiating a trial, all the foreseeable risks and inconvenience should be weighed against the anticipated benefit for the individual trial subject. And you'll see that in Canada, we're much more cognizant of terms, and we feel that the term research participant is a more sort of, I guess, like a softer or better word. It's consistent with what Tri-Council policy statement uses as a term, but ICH and FDA still very much stick to the term trial subject. And initiation and continuation of a trial should only occur if the anticipated benefits justify the risks. So this would be an REB principle, right, that they would look at. So the REB is very much interested in the rights and well-being of research participants. So they look at this principle when they review your research study application. So it's that risk-benefit balance, and that is one of the 3 foundational ethical principles that comes out of the Belmont document. So the first one is autonomy, you get consent. The second one is beneficence, non-maleficence, which is this one. So you want to make sure that you derive the most benefit with imposing the least amount of risk. And then the third one is justice, which means that the benefits of the research are equally distributed across populations. The next one is rights and safety and well-being of trial subjects are the most important considerations and should prevail over interests of science and society. The available non-clinical and clinical information on investigational products should be adequate to support the proposed clinical trial. This is why the REB asks you to submit an investigator's brochure, because the investigator's brochure details all of the clinical trials to date at the time of the application that they have available. So they're obligated to look at that information. And of course, the protocol would support it as well. And clinical trials should be scientifically sound and described in a clear, detailed protocol. So they do, when you do a CTA or clinical trial application to Health Canada, they do look at the proposed methodology. That's one of their components that they review before they issue a no objection letter. The trial should be conducted in compliance with the protocol that has received your prior REB favorable opinion, you'll recognize this as a protocol deviation. If it's not followed, that is the process that you need to submit to your REB or the documentation. So if something happens outside a window, or if somebody was giving something or something happens to them in a study visit that deviates from what the REB approved, then you're obligated to submit a protocol deviation to sponsor and to REB. The medical care given to and medical decisions made on behalf of subjects should always be the responsibility of a qualified physician or a qualified dentist. So QIs, or qualified investigators, under a clinical trial application with Health Canada have to be one of these two things. They are considering nurse practitioner to be an appropriate qualified principal investigator, but I'm not sure that that's been released. That was what Health Canada was considering that. And not only a qualified physician, but they have to be registered in the jurisdiction under which the clinical trial is happening. So a principal investigator doing a clinical trial in New Brunswick has to be registered and qualified to provide medical care in New Brunswick. You'll also see this medical care and medical decisions when we ask you to assign causality to serious adverse events. Whether or not a serious adverse event is related or not, that's a medical decision. And if you're a nurse or somebody else that's working on a study, that would not be within your scope to determine that causality. So it has to be within your scope, and it has to be by a qualified physician. The other area is with eligibility. So eligibility, because you're essentially making a diagnosis, it has to be under the care of a qualified physician or a dentist. Each individual involved in conducting a trial should be qualified by education, training, and experience to perform his or her respective task. These folks you're going to see on your delegation log. The principal investigator is ultimately responsible for everybody on that delegation log. Actually, it's responsible for everything regarding the conduct of that trial. So qualified by education means what I just kind of alluded to. If you have an RN that's on your delegation log, you need to have sort of evidence of qualifications of education. So you have to stay in your lane. You've got to stay within your scope and what your governing body has, permits you to do within that qualification or that classification. Training is what we're doing today. It's GCP training, but it's also protocol specific training. So there's something in there specific that you need to do so that you can undertake that task. Your training has to be completed, documented, and signed off before you start doing it, if it's on the delegation log. And you also have to have experience to perform your respective task. And finally, every subject should freely give informed consent before clinical trial participation. And this is actually comes from Nuremberg Code. So Nuremberg, because we know what happened in Nazi Germany, that prisoners of war had horrific research experimentation conducted on them without their informed consent. This is the very first principle in the Nuremberg Code, that every subject should be able to give their informed consent willingly and freely. There are exceptions, of course, and we can talk about that for substitute decision maker in those types of situations. Clinical trial information should be recorded and handled and stored in a way that allows its accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification, and that's no matter what medium it's collected on. The confidentiality records that could identify subjects should be protected, respecting the privacy and confidentiality rules in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. So we know that we're subject to the provincial privacy legislations. When you submit a research study application, we look at the privacy and confidentiality section of your informed consent document to make sure it conforms. We also look at how you're recruiting your participants to make sure that access to information is permissible within your circle of care. Investigational products should be manufactured, handled, and stored in accordance with the applicable GMP, and they should be used in accordance with the approved protocol. So if this is a function that's delegated to pharmacy, pharmacy has standard operating procedures in place to do that. If you're storing, dispensing, and doing accountability of your own IP or investigational product, you have to have a standard operating procedure for that, and you have to ensure that people that are doing that are doing it within their qualifications. And finally, systems and procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of the trial should be implemented. These are your standard operating procedures. This is what they want to see. So without actually explicitly saying you need SOPs, this is essentially what that is saying, that you need to have standard operating procedures. Are there any questions so far? No.
Not a question, but just something ridiculous. Can you believe that on social media, some of the anti-vaxxers tried to claim that the COVID vaccine was quote unquote against the Nuremberg Code, but like I corrected them, like, well, I think you got the wrong use of the Nuremberg Code and everything. Can you believe that?
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
I can believe that, unfortunately, and yeah, I mean, I think there's a concern that, you know, these vaccines were produced really, really quickly, but in order for us to get to where we have been today, everything that I'm presenting to you right now had to have been followed, and it was because these were approved. Well, they were emergency use authorization in the US first and here, but they've been approved by the regulatory authorities, and each company that did those clinical trials had to adhere to all these standards. I mean, that is actually, you know, it's what's required.
Right.
And the other thing is mRNA technology has been in investigation or in development for over 10 years. So they essentially had the blueprint there, but it was never, it just didn't have a real home. Like they were before COVID, they were looking at it for other indications, but of course there were other priorities that were out there at the time. So they already had the technology was developed. It was already there.
Yeah, it just seemed like they took some like part of something, and you know, as often people that don't know what they're talking about do, they took like part of it and totally twisted it out of context, you know what I mean, just to try to make it suit their needs, you know what I mean. They didn't even understand, like you said, the process that you're describing, and they just tried to, you know,
Yeah.
take it and make it fit their needs when it wasn't even in the right context.
It's not, yeah, you're right. It's not in the right context. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, to say that and I think what you're referring to, Sarah, is vaccine mandates where people are, you know, experiencing consequences with their employment and things like that as a result of not being vaccinated. And that's an infringement on their individual rights.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
I
which
didn't
is a
really
different.
understand why they brought it up, but I just told them, sorry, that's not the correct use of the Nuremberg Code.
No, and no, and absolutely not. And we, you know, if you study, you know, sort of the research ethics evolution and why we are where we are today. I mean, it started with those horrible atrocities of World War II. And, you know, even like I said, even after Nuremberg was released, there were still terrible things that happened. And which is why, and they were physician related things, right? So this is why the World Medical Association said, you know, we need to have these ethical guidelines, you need to adhere to them. But yeah, the principle of informed consent is first and foremost the most important principle, and it speaks to the you know, their autonomous right to make a decision as to whether or not something happens to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we think about ICH E6, so when do they apply? Well, as you can see, a few slides back, there are, and you know, it's an international standard. It's essentially it's actually the golden rule for the conduct of clinical research using medicinal products internationally. So whether or not countries have decided to adopt it as law, implement it as law, or adopt it and sort of integrate it into their various practices has been up to each individual country. Health Canada has actually adopted it, and you'll see it as law in the Food and Drug Regulations Part C Division 5. So there's actually a section, it's C.05.010 or 10 is the good clinical practice section of Division 5. And all of the principles that we just talked about are in that section.
Jacqueline?
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just a
No, go ahead.
question. When you say international guideline, what about like countries that don't have institutions such as the Food and Drug Regulations or the FDA and the Health Canada and stuff like that? What do these countries do they rely on, like things like Health Canada and FDA, or where do these countries get their permissions to do research on, or if they ever do? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question, and to be honest, I'm not really sure. I did look at on the ich.org website. There's a really good map about internationally what countries have adopted it. There's actually quite a few, so there really aren't a lot of people, or sorry, a lot of countries that don't follow these good clinical practice guidelines. As for the regulatory authorities, a number of them do have regulatory oversight, but specifically what that actual process would be. I'm not really sure outside of the European Union, the US, the not the regulators, but the members of the ICH Assembly, beyond them, like what they would use or what they would rely on. But I mean, it would be in their interest to follow GCP, right? Because if they do clinical trials and they want to have their data accepted in other countries.
Like for example, when for the vaccine that was done, there was a vaccine that was done in Russia and China and like these countries. What do they follow, and do they have their own organizations to approve these research that have been done? Like,
yeah, I know China is an observer. Like China's an observer, but their regulatory oversight mechanism is, I'm not sure. And similarly with Russia, but unless and that's actually a really good case, Rana, to bring up, because that there was skepticism around, especially when Russia came out with Sputnik vaccine. We were like, okay. But so the different countries where they would try to market that would scrutinize it really closely, and they first and foremost they would look at it through the ICH GCP lens, the E6, to ensure that that it was followed.
Thank you.
But I would direct you to ich.org, their website, because it was really interesting to see the different partners and their role in ICH, whether or not they were observers or adopters, and then specifically what their regulatory oversight is. What's their Health Canada equivalent in Slovakia or Russia? I'm not sure, but I'm sure there's something there. But whether or not it would meet the standards of US or Health Canada regulatory authorities is another question.
Yeah. Thank you.
If I may kind of add to the comment, was that like the last time I attended this one, I think it was one of the ICH consultation session that I sort of attended, and they were sort of reviewing the R3 and just going through some of the points there. And there was a representative, I think must have been one of the technical committee member or something, that was out of Japan, and he was sort of explaining how things are done over in Japan, and it was just really mind-blowing, and it was so different because we're talking about completely different structure and healthcare system than Canada or any part of the world, and everyone obviously has different setup. Some are similar, some are not, but to make sure that this ICH guideline actually kind of fits into that different system, it was just really different experience, sort of a different point of view. And when we look at it from Canada, maybe it's not going to be the exactly same interpretation, hopefully similar, but in other country, right? So there's so many different ways that things could turn out different. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's the intent is at at the technical committee level or the working group level, that you would have those different perspectives reflected so that there could be applicability and adaptability across multiple jurisdictions. I mean, that's sort of the intent. And, you know, I've only been fortunate enough to be on a standards development committee and developing 2 standards, and you just have just a broad scope of representation and different perspectives, you know. So when we were looking at HRPP standard, we had people who would use an HRPP standard. We had auditors and regulators on that committee to say, well, if I'm auditing against a standard, these are the types of things that I'm looking at. And then, you know, we had representatives on there who would be sort of the, you know, the kind of participant voice. So, you know, by the time you want to come up with a document that's succinct enough, but that has, you know, some flexibility so that, you know, all of those different countries and those just different jurisdictions would be able to comply with it. So typically what we say about a standard, which is what GCP is it tells you what is required. What it doesn't tell you is how you do that. So I think that's where the flexibility is. So as long as you can meet the requirement, how you do it is up to your own specific site and interpretation. So I don't know if that helps a little bit as well. But for Health Canada, like I said, it's law, it's Division 5, it's Part C Division 5. And to help you with interpretation and to understand how it's applied at the site, I would refer you to Guide 100. Health Canada put that out there to say, this is what we mean when we say that there can only be one qualified investigator at each site, and this is why we say that. It's really helpful because what was missing largely from Division 5 Part C was that applicability or the how type thing, that so to speak. So they did give you a bit of how you're going to do that. It's a really helpful guideline, and I know, you know, we try to use it when we're interpreting, especially systems and operations component, to say, you know, what do they actually mean when they say that each piece of equipment needs to be inspected by, you know, clinical engineering, those types of things. So that's a practical applicability of it, is to go to Guide 100 and say, you know, how do I comply with this? What are they going to be looking for when Health Canada comes to inspect? Because they are inspecting again, and they're actually going on site as well. For the US, it's not a requirement for them, but their regulations have been revised to be more consistent with the ICH requirements. I think specifically more the common rule. So the common rule is OHRP's guideline. So it's 45 Code of Federal Regulations 46. If you're interested, it's kind of dull, but you can take a look. We're obligated to be compliant with that because we receive funds from the Department of Health and Human Services. And so OHRP is sort of the TCPS2 or the pre-equivalent in the US. So they've come out with their own guidance and standards for clinical research that is funded through the Department of Health and Human Services. The FDA specifically has adopted it. So the terminology is implemented, meaning Health Canada has implemented its law. Adopted means it's not law, but they use it, they recognize it, and they also feel that their Code of Federal Regulations, the 21 part and all the subsequent codes that are applicable, have ICH GCP principles sort of embedded in them and integrated in, but they're not, I put this statement down there, does not create or confer any rights for any person and does not operate or bind FDA to the public. So they're not a legal standard in the US.
So what's the difference from them being legal like in the Canada and not legal like in the US if they're already implemented? Like what
does it
mean really? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think, I mean, in Canada, you would have the force of law behind it. So if there was a violation of Part C, Division 5, then there could be legal consequences. And when you have a Health Canada inspection, if you have a number of risk 1 observations, I mean, those can lead to suspension and heavy fines. So I think they're legally able to, you know, maybe go after you or look for sort of compliance or make amends through the legal system or through the legal lens, where the U.S. wouldn't. They don't give the ICH the weight of law, but the FDA, the CFR do. They're legal. So I don't know specifically what the distinction is, but I do know that violations of either one is not. It's not what you want, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to add to Jacqueline, what you just said now, it's mandation versus guidance. So guidance is you can do it. Mandation, you must.
You must, yeah. Yeah. So there's a difference, you know, when you see in documents, shall and should. So shall means you have to, should means you ought to, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Merdula. I'm just going to touch briefly on E8, and I did mention that earlier. And the reason I want to talk about it a little bit is that it's going to become more and more prevalent in clinical trials. You're going to see it more because it's just recently been revised. And so, as you can see, it's been adopted on the 6th of October 2021. So that's step 4, what we talked about earlier. Step 5 is implementation. So implementation, it would just be, could be a matter of time. I don't know if Health Canada is considering, making sections of E6 mandatory. I could see it having applicability when you do clinical trials applications, because E6 really is that foundational document that identifies a basic set of critical quality factors that can be adapted to different types of trials. And again, it's to support the reliability of trial results and to protect participants. So E8 is really to be considered when designing trials. So E8 is for the design of trials. E6 is for the conduct of trials. And what this revision talks about mostly is quality by design. And what they mean by that, they outline a couple of points, is that your research protocol has clear objectives that address your research question, that your selection of participants is appropriate to the type of study that you're undertaking, that you minimize bias in your design, meaning you use randomization or other methods to minimize that bias, and your endpoints are well defined. So some areas or other hospitals that we collaborate with or communicate with, such as BC, have already started doing training on E8 to their clinical trial sites. And so we will be looking at whether or not, this is going to be part of city training offerings in the future. That would be down the road, or if we're going to offer specific training on E8 R1. But that's just to be aware that is coming. And I would guide you to ICH.org website to take a look at ICH R1 and just go through it. But as I mentioned, it's one of the E guidelines in that E family of ICH guidelines, and it's specifically geared towards the design of clinical trials. And quality by design is a big factor in there. And the other factor that they included in this was to ensure that the participant voice was at the table when these studies are designed. So how that's going to look in the future, I'm not really sure, but it's a big emphasis on including patients as partners in the design of clinical research studies. Here you go, Sarah. So there's 2 important goals of ICH E6. So there's 4 listed here, but when we talked about what are the 2 things and the 2 takeaways from ICH E6 out of these 4, what are they? And you guys can just shout it out because I can't.
It's D.
What's that?
It's D. Letter D. D as in dog.
Yeah. 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 Perfect. Okay. We've been going for 47 minutes. So I think, why don't we just sort of take like a 5 to 6 minute bio break, and we'll come back. It's 12:47, so why don't we come back at like 5 or 6 minutes too, and then I'm going to switch it over to Stella, who's going to talk about investigative responsibilities. And just before we break away, I want to ask if there's any questions so far or comments. No? All
I just
righty.
want, yeah, I just want to let you know, guys, sorry, that this session's being recorded. So in case you guys needing a copy or share it with your team members, let me know as well. I can send a copy over to you later after the session, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll see you back at 5:02.